No reason why they shouldn't. And that's something we should be, essentially, all of us working towards. So those are the central objectives, it seems to me, in banking policy in the next few years. Let me just say something about the other major economic challenge, which is around the deficit. I get a sense that there is a bit of a state of denial about the problem of the public sector finances. I hope I'm not causing offence if I say I think the level of denial is relatively high in Scotland. And I've had a correspondent over last week with Alex Salmon that rather confirms that impression. But the fact is that there is going to have to be fiscal contraction. There is an issue of timing, as I've said. It makes no sense to rush into this and aggravate the recession, but it has to be faced. And much of it will take the form of restricting public spending, because public spending grew on the back of tax revenue that was fictitious. It was based on tax revenue for the financial sector and housing, which is gone, and it's a structural problem. It's not just to do with the cycle. And so public spending will have to be dealt with. And what I and my party are doing is to try to spell out, be as open and explicit as possible about what that entails. And it's not easy. You know, there's a resistance to facing these things. I've come up to talk to Reform Scotland. I'm now being pursued about something I wrote 9 months ago in a pamphlet for Reform England about some of those things that we are going to have to look at in terms of welfare spending. But we're going to have to do it. And there's no way of avoiding it. And as I've just referred back a few moments ago to correspondence with Alex Salmon, and even he accepts that at the very least 2011-12, spending will have to be cut. And it's important that we have a proper public debate on how this happens. Because if it just happens through, serendipity and letting Sir Humphrey sort this problem out, I mean, we know what will happen. Governments always cut investment first. It's the easiest thing to do, you're cutting the problem onto the private sector. Very damaging. Doesn't just damage the construction industry, but it undermines your infrastructure. The next thing governments do is to pass the problem on to local government. There's probably some other party running it. Pass the problem on to them. And the core of government spending is not addressed. And that's where the issues do have to be addressed, in the current spending of government. And let's have a proper debate about how it's done. So, we have to tackle the banks, we're going to have to tackle the budget deficit, and it's going to be very painful and very difficult. I'll just make 2 final thoughts. That if this process is to succeed, we have to keep the public with us, and that's partly a question of being open and having a public debate about what's cut and what isn't. But it's also about creating in the population a sense of fairness. People are not going to wear cuts in public services if they feel that we're living in a society which is massively unequal, and in particular that the people in the city, who many people blame for having caused this problem, are walking away with vast rewards. And I think the answer to that question is at least partly to be found in the taxation system. One of the things that my colleagues and I will be arguing for is a system of national UK taxation which lifts taxes on people on low incomes, actually lifts taxes despite the fiscal squeeze, lifts the tax threshold around 10,000, lifts 3-4 million people across the UK out of tax, low-paid workers, some pensioners in terms of investment income, and you have higher taxes on people who are very wealthy, in order to, there are people in this room who would have to pay some of it. And there are plenty of areas where very high incomes are sheltered from taxation, the massive differential between earned income tax and capital gains tax, the very large pension pots which get you higher rates of tax relief, this controversial mansion tax, very high value property. And we would argue that some of that extra tax should be channeled into tax cuts at the bottom. If you do that, you then begin to create a public willing to confront the realities of the very, very painful and difficult choices we're going to have to face over the next few years. And it is going to be a struggle. perhaps just mention when I throw the final lines that I referred at the beginning to my immersion in public life and politics in my early 20s in Glasgow. That was also the period when Britain had last time Britain had a comparable period of economic difficulty. Remember the financial crisis of the late 60s, the Heath administration coming in, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, radical reforms, and they ground to a halt after 18 months, 2 years, because they couldn't carry the public with them. And we've got to avoid that. And the only way, it seems to me, of doing it is to be honest on the one hand, and to make it absolutely clear that the burdens, which there will be, are going to have to be fairly shared. So thank you for your attention.
Right, any questions? Amanda.
Is my microphone on? Yes, it is. Amanda Harvey, Trustee of Reform Scotland and Managing Director of the Harvey Consultancy. Vince, I'd like to ask you a question for you to answer in the context of your previous expertise as an economist and with the caveat that Shell placed upon you, which is to remember that things are easier with the benefit of hindsight and to look from a scenario perspective. You used a metaphor at the beginning which aligned the current crisis that we face and challenge that we face with that of a patient in intensive care. Edinburgh in Scotland, of course, is the centre of medical excellence. And
I've forgotten that one, wasn't
the difference that we face in my mind at the moment is that as medicine advanced, one had predictable scenarios emerging, and surgeons and academics were able to learn from continuous progress and experience. This is, in effect, in the territory of an unknown unknown. Are you comfortable that the response being taken by politicians and policymakers and regulators is appropriate, given that we cannot operate from the benefit of hindsight, and it is quite clear that the next crisis we may face will not be in this territory at all? Do you think there's a danger that we are being too prescriptive and restrictive?
No, I think, I hope I made this clear. I think although we are in unknown territory, the policy response to the emergency was essentially right. I've been, highly critical of this government in many respects, particularly Gordon Brown's reluctance to acknowledge the dangers involved in the build-up of domestic debt and the housing bubble and the rest of it. But I think the response to the emergency was basically right. It was an unprecedented situation, but it was right to experiment with the creation of money. People worried then and still worried that this could be highly inflationary, but it's been very carefully orchestrated through the Bank of England. I think it was right to resort to large-scale deficit financing to get us through the worst of this crisis, that we're now going to face the pain of correcting that. And I think it was also right to intervene to take over the banking system. I think the government should have been, in a way, more direct in just accepting that you cannot have the privatisation of profit and the nationalisation of loss and having a more direct role in directing the banking system. But I think the basic strategy that was adopted was correct, even though we're in, as you say, very uncertain times and dealing with very unconventional policy.